The first point of this chapter is thinking about our story of human evolution. And the book outlines, I think, pretty well about what we used to think from about 1987, when they did some of the first mitochondrial studies of trying to go back and figure out genetic change in the human population. People got very into what became known as African Eve or Mitochondrial Eve, a common mother to all human beings, they said. And so about 75,000 years ago, it was thought that all human beings came from a common source, and that since they were common since they were sort of uniform, and when they spread into different climates, that's when we got more diverse, say different skin tones and things like that. And at the time, from, like I said, there were all these discoveries of Neanderthals, Neanderthal bones and stuff that Neanderthals were doing in Europe, mostly because a lot of the archaeology was done in Europe. But they could find no evidence for any kind of interbreeding with Neanderthals from these Homo sapiens. In 2010, or now, there was some more sophisticated genetic analysis which revealed something rather surprising, because the studies had been had shown that this did not seem to be the case. But we now believe that the creatures who would eventually lead to Homo sapiens were interacting with a much more diverse range of bipedals, large, somewhat larger heads, two-legged, walking on two legs throughout the history of hominids. And as Graeber and Wengrow put it, it's part of something that we call a kind of mosaic evolution. So that evolution doesn't just proceed in a straight line. It brings together different pieces and at different rates. And it's complicated all of our old ideas. And as Descartes put it, what do we know now about this interbreeding stuff in the Neanderthals?
So I didn't know there was another species besides the Neanderthals walking around, but
yeah,
it has been known that you didn't see that threat and that we were able to still breed with them, meaning that there were some species, so because of the interesting, there's multiple different species everywhere.
Right.
Like having
yeah, so we figured out that there had to be some interbreeding with Neanderthals, and most all of us have at least some percentage of Neanderthal ancestry or from other archaics, as they're called. Denisovans were kind of discovered at the same time. They're more discovered genetically than they are archaeologically. So we don't have a lot of archaeological fossil evidence for Denisovans, but the genetic evidence is pretty good, and there does seem to be interbreeding as well with some Homo sapien populations. And so what we now know is those weren't actually, in the biological sense, distinct species, because there was interbreeding. They are at best subspecies. Or I mean, they would be considered subspecies of the larger group. And so when we think about humans today, as the Neanderthals disappeared and the Denisovans disappeared and other archaics that we haven't necessarily named, maybe Homo naledi, for example, disappeared, we end up with only bipedal humans as a single interbreeding species across the whole of the world. And so some people have said that humans are a relict species. That is to say, we are the leftovers of what was once a much more diverse biological species. And so when we look at differences that we call, say, race across the world, they are very, very minor as compared to the kinds of differences that would have been between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the humans then. People were much more used to interacting and even interbreeding with a much more diverse population than we see today. It's not to say that there aren't different biological differences among human beings. Obviously there are. They're just not as pronounced as they would have been back in the day. So just show you a couple pictures of what we think is happening. We think happened. Of course, almost all human evolution happens in Africa, where you have, Homo naledi and other archaic African, it's kind of a funny word, archaic, but that's the word that is used. We have various migrations into and back and out of Africa, and some Neanderthal admixture, so that both Asian populations and European populations, and eventually also African populations, have at least some Neanderthal admixture. It seems that there was some Denisovan admixture somewhere, although the evidence for Denisova comes to us from the Denisova cave in Siberia. So somewhere there was, because the genetics are showing up. And then people get into Australia somehow. That's a pretty amazing feat. And into Indonesia. And we even have those Homo floresiensis somehow got the little hobbit peoples somehow either got here or came here as different and evolved there differently on the island. But most of these but the archaic species disappeared, leaving us with Homo sapiens. So we have a very much more complex picture of human evolution than we used to have. And like I said, we now know that Homo sapiens are in some ways less biologically diverse than the existing range of bipedals. A couple of you wanted to know about or remembered how people got into the Americas. And there's been some recent genetic research on this, summarized in Jennifer Raff's book called Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas. And she basically says that the people who would come into the Americas came from Siberia, spent a decent amount of time up here in the north in what was Beringia, and then probably for the most part came down the coast, and from the coast spread out into the inland. So the idea that there was this Ice Age big game hunters chasing mammoths into the Americas is probably not as accurate as some of these coastal routes, which accounts for the fact that in both North America and South America, the places become relatively well populated at about 15,000 years ago, it looks like. So in any case, by about 15,000 years ago, we have Homo sapiens, a single interbreeding species having spread out all across the habitable world, and some of the other archaics have disappeared. Neanderthals are gone. So in terms of biological diversity, we see in some ways what Graeber and Wengrow are saying is there was probably both biological diversity and social diversity. In terms of the biology, though, that gets, like I said, the diversity gets reduced. We then see what we call complex culture emerge. And in the old days, we used to think that the human biology got relatively set in Africa at around 200,000 years ago. And so those are called anatomically modern humans. Humans, Homo sapiens, that would have looked kind of within the range of what we consider modern humans to be. But what was confusing is that although the biology seemed to be in place and the head size and all those things, these kinds of what we call complex culture came in at around 45,000 years ago. So there was already stone tool use and a bunch of evidence for different kinds of culture at, as early as 2.5 to 3 million years ago. But the kinds of things like art and music and clothing and all those things seem to come in at about 45,000 years ago, which led to a bunch of people believing that there must have been some sort of revolution or burst of creativity then. And so people speculated that there was some kind of mutation that we couldn't sense, but must have put it all together, that maybe that's when language was formed and people could talk to each other. And Graeber and Wengrow make the argument that the revolution was simply, or is, an illusion of the way in which we do archaeology. Why? Where do we get most of our archaeological evidence from, or have in the past? Yeah, we want to go. I guess I should specify what area of the world has seen the most archaeology done. Yes. Yeah. So basically what they're saying is that the 45,000 years ago is a mirage, an illusion based on the fact that most archaeology has been funded by European governments. And so, they would go looking for King Arthur's sword or some other burial and be like, hey, we found it, yay. So that's basically what was cool to do. They say that, even as we're writing this book, there's been some new finds in archaeology, that as archaeology expands into other areas, so they talk about the Southern African cave site of Panga Ya Saidi, and also the cave art that has been found in Borneo and Sulawesi, which seems to predate some of the European finds. So what they're saying is the idea that culture comes in at about 40,000 years ago is mainly based on where we've done our archaeology. So a couple pictures. This is Panga Ya Saidi Cave. It's in southern Africa. And we know that, as they say in this article, that this has been an important site of human habitation. And this is going back 60 or 70,000 years that we see things like marine shell beads and abstract engraving on the shell beads. So this is in southern Africa at about 60 to 7,000 years ago. Yeah, Cyrus. Where is the cave? On the picture.
Where is it?
Oh, where's the cave? This is like the entrance to it. You'd have to go in there further. Yeah. Yeah, you didn't get a picture of like way inside the cave. You're right. But that could be that could be a good paper to write. And here you can watch some YouTube cave art, the oldest cave art so far found in Sulawesi, Indonesia, which is pretty far away from the European cave sites that we all get excited about and we learn about in art history. But these are different and I'm not going to say cooler, but older anyway, at least for now. So Graeber and Wengrow are making the point that, or are trying to make a point about social diversity of all of these groups that when they were in Africa and as people expanded into different areas. In the old days, we used to think, and we talked about this a little bit, we modeled people used to model human social arrangements based on chimpanzees. So there are these ideas of the killer ape, movies about the killer ape, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And they were basically thinking, because of some of the evidence that was coming out from Jane Goodall and the chimpanzee sites, which, as it turns out, were in some ways influenced by the fact that human beings were providing the chimpanzees with food and other things, but they got very interested in chimpanzee hierarchies and that they seemed to go to war with each other every so often or fight each other, and these male dominance displays. So people got all excited about this and said that, aha, that's what humans must have been like. But then the other primatologists came along and found the bonobos, which are equally related to us evolutionarily speaking. There, we have the chimpanzee human split, but there was another split about 2 million years ago between the bonobos and the chimpanzees. So it's, they're evolutionarily equidistant from humans. And so for those of you who've ever seen bonobo footage, they're all sexed up and they're doing sex with all kinds of sex. But which mainly turns out to be because they're in captivity and bored. But it's interesting because that's what they do when they're bored, and chimpanzees like to beat each other up when they're bored. So, but in the wild, you see some sex, but not as much. Anyway, people got way into the bonobos. They seemed to be more, and the importance of females, more egalitarian, and of course the sex. And so people got excited about that. And on page 93, you can read about the people who have said that each is potentially a model. Most anthropology, except for some people who really liked Napoleon Chagnon and the Yanomamo and the Fierce people, but most anthropology started to tend toward the view that gatherers and hunters would have been more like the bonobos, or they might be hunting, but they were in these egalitarian little small bands, and that women would have been important to the gathering process. Now, what anthropologists started to say, what anthropologists were saying is that wasn't because they were necessarily got this all from the apes, either chimpanzees or bonobos. Rather, people used social tactics to bring down the braggarts, which is to say, as they say, that gorillas beat their chests, but it's only humans that make fun of people who beat their chests, right? We're the ones who make fun of people who try to put themselves up above. So they're talking about here the work of Christopher Bohm. They're citing his book called Hierarchy in the Forest, but this is kind of a similar idea, which is to talk about the ideas of shaming people and making them be altruistic or making them participate in society. So as Graeber and Wengrow quote on page 86 from Bohm, Bohm identifies a whole panoply of tactics collectively employed to bring would-be braggarts and bullies down to earth. Ridicule, shame, shunning, none of which have any parallel among other primates. So for those of you who've read, for example, Richard Lee's little article on eating Christmas in the Kalahari, they talks about how he was trying to buy them a big cow for their festivities after doing field work, and they made fun of him for doing it. Basically what they're saying is this is what we do to people to make sure they don't get big heads and think that they're all important. So anthropologists started to think about the ways in which human societies were differently organized. And we now know that as people used gathering and hunting and spread out all over the habitable world, hunting and gathering became very different in different places. So obviously in the Arctic, you're going to rely more on hunting and large mammals. In tropical forests, you're probably going to rely more on plant food. In Australia, so there are all kinds of different ways of hunting and gathering, and all sorts of different economic and social and political arrangements as well. At least that is what Graeber and Wengrow are trying to claim. So just to sum up, that in some ways the human biological diversity, Homo sapiens, may be less than in the past, but in terms of their social diversity and the way in which hunters and gatherers had different arrangements in different parts of the world, we can still see a wide range of human societies. Now, for the most part, when it came to agriculture, anthropologists believed, or we used to think, that it was agriculture that made possible a number of things, such as dense populations. So we once thought that you couldn't have people coming together in large groups unless you had an agricultural base that could support those kinds of large group populations, that hunting and gathering had to be done in small bands. We also used to think that when it came to sort of burying the dead, kinds of stuff that archaeologists like to dig up, that it was when you saw wealth objects being buried, especially with children who had died, that meant that that was a sign that social hierarchy had developed. Because why would a child be buried with these objects unless they came from some sort of noble or inherited hierarchy? We also used to think that it was only with agriculture that you could have big kinds of monumental stuff, big buildings and temples and those kinds of things, in part because how would you get the labor to do that? How would you bring people together and feed them and be able to organize labor and to be able to tell other people what to do? Hunters and gatherers didn't seem to be to have that kind of capacity in order to create what we consider to be monumental architecture. So what anthropologists were saying is that as people developed agriculture and started to grow food and produce these surpluses, that it wasn't necessarily a good thing, bless you, but that it was a departure from these egalitarian bands that would be going around, and it also brings us a lot more of the gender distinctions in terms of gender divisions of labor, which would be translated into women having to work harder and being literal beasts of burden. So the idea was, and it was kind of, as you note, a fairly Rousseauian idea, that it is agriculture, which is the downfall or the departure from these small egalitarian bands, that it makes possible these other kinds of stratification. Now, the fun part, I think. In recent years, we found these hunter-gatherers doing some weird things. Cyrus, what were they doing?
Social hierarchy to the classes, so on that and burial side of that. People don't normally associate with time period.
People don't normally associate with the time period. There was these elaborate burials. Hold off on the social hierarchy, Cyrus. That's the very issue at hand. We're just going to go with the archaeological evidence. We're seeing a burial like the Principe of Dolny Vestunice. Boy, I'm probably mispronouncing that crazily, somewhere over in the Czech Republic, or what is now the Czech Republic. So we have these burials, and again, this is like Ice Age time, so they're not supposed to be doing these wealth burials, and it's kind of crazy. There's a few of them popping up all in this place. In one case, well, we have the Il Principe with blades of exotic flint. He's got a flint scepter, elk antler batons, and an ornate headdress. And then we also have this Lady of Saint-Germain de la Rivière. It contains a rich assemblage of stomach and pelvic ornaments. It sounds kind of yucky, but anyway, made of shell and stag teeth. The teeth are taken from deer hunted in the Spanish Basque Country 190 miles away. Crazy, right? So we have these hunter-gatherers somehow carrying out these elaborate burials. Matt, what else are they doing? Your picture.
scraps that couldn't be decomposed, stuff like that, so they basically threw it all into those.
Well, not just thrown though. Some of them were these massive mammoth things where you'd have the things arranged in a certain way and you could see them from miles around. Hunters and gatherers aren't supposed to be doing these things. They're building things basically. And what this means is that you have these strange things that the hunters and gatherers are doing. You don't have agriculture, but they have bustling centers of trade and craft production. As another reminder that Graeber and Wengrow are writing this to us from the UK because they spell these words wrong, the centers with an R-E instead of an E-R. Don't do it, but that's what they do because they're
I'm typing and the computer autocorrect is.
It did autocorrect a center with an ER. Yeah, well, that's because we live in America and that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do American English, but you know, I just copied and pasted. It wouldn't correct. It's yeah, it's hard to say if you should correct or I know. It actually it doesn't. I'm ambivalent. I'm agnostic on that point. I have no religion on that. If you are quoting from a source that is doing a UK spelling, it's okay to use UK spelling. I'm not gonna get mad.
Now, if we spell them like that.
If you just start spelling like that and you're, you know, then I might have to wonder about your education. Except Alicia's already informed me that she grew up with these centers of in her centers of education, everything was RE and single quotes. That's like back to
That's what colonization does.
that's what colonization does. Exactly. Teaches you how to spell things a different way. And now here we are in a different form of colonization. All right, let's look at some pictures. So this is Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic is pretty interesting because it gives us some of those so-called Venus, Ice Age Venus figurines. And we have the triple burial here going on. So pretty remarkable stuff going on. Again, way before anything agricultural would have been. And then, well, Matt gave us one of the mammoth places, but there's also this place, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was 6,000 years before Stonehenge. And people have been trying to figure out what the heck people were doing there. Again, long before agriculture. So some people like Cyrus said, aha, that means that the hunter-gatherers were hierarchical too. See, they must have been all wealth status and hierarchy. Look at those buildings, look at those burials, look at that wealth and stuff. That must mean they have social hierarchy. Alicia, what do our authors tell us about this?
They were saying that we should not jump in, little else was indicated to indicate like the growth of the society or even like the states.
Yeah, we'll read in the second part of this chapter for the next class. We'll read a little bit more about the burials and the kinds of people that were actually kinds of skeletons these were. But there doesn't seem to be much evidence for durable social hierarchies during this phase. So the idea is that they were simply hierarchical because they buried their dead or because they could build a building doesn't seem to hold water. Cyrus?
It's like they're being like they're right before that, and they're like saying that only a few burial sites indicate that like only a few member of the society got buried, you know that?
Yeah.
Had a sign up like
Well, keep that in mind as you read the next part of the chapter and the kinds of skeletons that you see that were buried. Actually, you might remember one of them. Wait, didn't you talk about the other?
Before,
Yeah. The
guy with the genetic disorder.
the guy with the genetic disorder. Yeah. So keep in mind what kind of watch what's going to happen here. Anyway, what they're saying is that the problem that we have is our old problem is that we have one model in it. We either say that there's one model that humans are all egalitarian naturally, or that humans are all hierarchically natural. And so because we only have two ideas in our head and maybe only one, whenever we see evidence or whenever we see a certain kind of grave or a certain kind of building, we say, aha, that must mean we've gone hierarchical. And if we see evidence for something else, we're egalitarian. So their big point here is that actually human societies were diverse, socially and politically diverse, that there was a whole bunch of things going on, that there were a range of arrangements, that they weren't purely egalitarian and they weren't purely hierarchical either. And so they're trying to say that there is a diversity of human societies going on, both socially and politically and economically, and we shouldn't simply cover up that diversity by flip-flopping between these two models of either Rousseauian egalitarianism or Hobbesian hierarchy. To make that point, one of the things that they're saying is that people, as we saw, heard, read in the last class, and we'll read more for the next, that people were thinking about their societies, that they had political consciousness, that they were able to imagine social alternatives and to make choices about what kind of society they wanted to live in. And this is something that we talked about with Candiaronk in the last class, is being able to have a conversation or a dialogue and look at society from the outside or inside and be able to have an argument about it. And they make the interesting point here is that the one they say that the neuroscientists say that that actually most of the time we can't can't hold thoughts in our head for very long. It's difficult to hold a thought in our head. Anybody had this problem, trying to hold a thought in your head? And they say that the neuroscientists tell us that we can do it for about 7 seconds. That's about the amount of time we can hold a thought in our head. But they say there is one exception to how we can hold thoughts in our head for more than 7 seconds. And that's when we are having a conversation with somebody. When we are in a dialogue, we can actually talk to another person, or we used to be able to for hours, and we can keep honing our argument as long as we are talking to another person. And so they say that human thought is inherently dialogic, and that's why the Candiaronk dialogues, he's arguing with Lahontan, or books that are written in the dialogic fashion, are so important, because it enables us to hold these thoughts in our head for more than 7 seconds. I think that's why teaching is so different. For me, if I read something, read it in one way, and then if I try to teach, it becomes totally different, because there's something about that back and forth, which means you can hopefully hold your thoughts for more than 7 seconds. And so what they're saying is that in indigenous societies, having these kinds of conversations was a part of their lives. It wasn't just in the now that people do this.